The name Auschwitz is a statistic, over 1 million dead. But behind the numbers was a machine for psychological destruction. It began with a shovel and a prisoner digging his own grave. Soviet POWs were brought to the edge of the camp. They were forced to dig deep pits. Then they were ordered to stand on the edge. A single shot. The body fell into the earth it had just moved. No trial, no record. The work was brutal. Some prisoners were put into labor units. They built fences, cleared roads. Their hands helped construct the massive expansion site just a few kilometers away. Months later, these same execution pits would form the foundations for a new complex. Auschwitz II, Birkenau. The geography of murder was expanding. But not all death was hidden. Some was a performance. The SS staged public executions in the main camp's roll call yard, the Appellplatz. Thousands of prisoners were forced to assemble, forced to watch. The gallows used a specific design, a short rope. The drop was minimal, insufficient to sever the spinal cord. It did not break the neck. It guaranteed slow asphyxiation, a public spectacle of suffering. The only sound was the rope creaking under tension. Prisoners stood for hours, forbidden to move, forbidden to look away. The bodies remained after the crowd dispersed. They were left hanging until the next morning's roll call. The hangings were a symptom. The system itself was about to break. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union flooded Auschwitz with new transports. 3 emaciated bodies per one narrow wooden bunk. How did the camp handle thousands of new prisoners? The infrastructure did not bend. It shattered. Soviet prisoners of war were dragged from the trains, shoeless, exhausted, many unconscious. The wooden bunks were designed for one person. They held 3. This overload triggered a systemic collapse. Sanitation systems failed. Latrines overflowed. Disease swept through the barracks. Prisoners became biological hazards. But for some, disease was too slow. Soviet commissars and political officers were a special category. They were taken directly from the ramp, marched behind the camp fence, and shot. There were no trials, no sentences. Their deaths were never recorded. Soviet prisoners were statistical losses, unrecorded. But in July 1941, Commandant Rudolf Haas required a more personal form of terror. A single prisoner escaped from Block 14. The response was not a search, it was a demonstration. Haas ordered 10 men from the block to be executed. He stood before the lineup. He did not ask for names, he called out numbers. One number belonged to Sergeant Franciszek Gajowniczek. He cried out for his family. The expectation? An investigation to find the guilty man. The reality? The slow death of 10 random numbers. Then, another prisoner stepped forward. Prisoner 16,670, Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish priest. He volunteered to die in Gajowniczek's place. Haas, surprised, agreed to the exchange. The 10 were forced into a starvation cell in Block 11, a concrete box deep underground. The heavy door slammed shut, a final metallic clang. Inside, no food, no water. Without water, the human body fails in 3 days. They were sealed in darkness. He endured for 2 weeks without food. The system enabling Rudolf Haas's experiments was set in motion in May 1940. A machine built from existing Polish army barracks. Why seize these specific buildings near the town of Oswiecim? The site offered 2 strategic assets: total isolation and ready-made railway logistics. The click of wheels on steel announced each new delivery. On June 14, 1940, the first transport arrived. 728 men. They were not criminals. They were Polish lawyers, teachers, and resistance members. The intellectual core of a nation. Haas took command. He was the architect of the camp's new protocol. The barracks were no longer military housing. They became processing centers for human beings. A bureaucratic pipeline. The first step was erasure. The prisoners lined up for registration. Their past lives were irrelevant. The SS clerks struck out their names and replaced them with serial numbers. The serial numbers were only a registry. By the end of 1940, isolation became public theater. A new protocol was established, the Protocol of Death. The stage was the camp's roll call square. Prisoners were forced into formation, thousands of men arranged in geometric blocks. SS guards formed an armed perimeter. Their rifles were not aimed at the condemned, they were aimed at the audience. The order was absolute. Watch, do not move. A prisoner looking away was a crime. A single step out of line was an act of rebellion. The punishment was immediate. The condemned were hanged or shot. The bodies remained on display for hours. A technical demonstration of control, a warning. By the end of the year, at least 40 prisoners were killed this way. Reasons were simple. An escape attempt, a shared piece of bread. Some were accused of sabotage. For this charge, the SS required no proof. A prisoner was executed. The charge? Looking at a guard the wrong way. The protocols of public death had moved beyond the main camp. They became a feature of a new, sprawling territory, Birkenau. The barracks there were unfinished shells, no insulation, no proper floors. A piercing wind cut through the thin wooden walls. Why such random terror? Why kill for a simple glance? The main SS office had lost all oversight. Local guards at Birkenau answered to no one. This new sector was Auschwitz II Birkenau, a vast construction site filled with Soviet prisoners of war and Jews. Here, the SS built a different kind of execution machine. Simple wooden support beams, driven directly into the open fields. The prisoners marched past these gallows every day, to work and from work. The accusations became trivial. Sabotage, disobedience. One man was hanged for taking a single extra piece of bread. That death was not an exception. By late 1941, it was protocol, a system. How do you force thousands to abandon even the thought of resistance? You make death their daily background. The process was engineered. An SS officer steps forward. He holds a list. He reads a number. The prisoner is shoved onto the platform, often already beaten. Under threat, he is forced to speak, a scripted warning to the others. Then, a sharp kick throws him from the platform. The camp population exceeded 20,000, a massive humanity requiring total control, every single day, without exception. Thousands of men were forced to watch death become routine. The bodies were left hanging. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of thousands of wooden shoes marching past the corpses to the work sites. A constant visual terror. This was not punishment. It was a technology of psychological paralysis. Engineered in Block 11, perfected in the open fields of Birkenau. The goal was to break the mind. The question among the prisoners shifted. It was no longer if someone would be killed, only who. The system answered, who? But in September 1942, it failed. 2 Polish prisoners breached the perimeter, gone, in civilian clothes. The reprisal was not for the escapees, it was for those left behind. 15 men were pulled from their barracks. They belonged to the same work unit. The entire camp population was forced onto the main assembly square. Thousands stood in formation, watching. Gallows were erected in the center of the square. The 15 selected men were positioned. Trapdoors opened beneath their feet. The thousands of prisoners stood in absolute paralyzed silence. It was broken only by the sound of 15 men choking. The primitive camp gallows did not provide a long drop to break the neck. Death was not instant. It was slow asphyxiation. Guards patrolled the lines of prisoners. Anyone who looked away received a rifle butt to the face. For minutes, the bodies of the 15 men struggled against the ropes, slowly suffocating before the silent crowd. Public executions were theater. The real war was fought in the shadows. By 1943, Auschwitz was an industrial machine, but it was also a battlefield. Officially, a factory for extermination. Unofficially, a front line against invisible military resistance. The Gestapo's political department began a secret war. Their targets were not ordinary prisoners, they were soldiers. What did a machine that killed thousands per day fear? A few dozen captive Soviet POWs. These men were military professionals. Some were officers. They had training. And the SS believed they were organizing an underground network. They were a threat. In March 1943, the hunt began. The Gestapo identified 74 Soviet prisoners in Block 11. They were marched into the small courtyard between Block 10 and Block 11. The yard was sealed by high stone walls, a sound barrier, to muffle the constant reports of a pistol from the rest of the camp. One by one, they were shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were loaded onto carts. The execution was not public, but the aftermath was. Prisoners saw the increased SS patrols, the new tension, the sudden absence. That night, 74 bunks in Block 11 were empty. The SS paranoia targeted more than just military professionals. It targeted any flicker of defiance, any unsanctioned act of humanity. This terror had a public face, a theatrical ritual of control. October 15, 1942, 4 young Jewish prisoners were caught near a service gate. Their escape plan was simple, a drainage ditch. They were discovered before they could move. The response was immediate, system-wide. Loudspeakers ordered all prisoners to the camp square. Thousands stood motionless. The piercing, icy October wind cut through their thin uniforms. SS officers delivered long speeches from a platform. The message, zero tolerance. The 4 prisoners were marched to the gallows. The bodies were left hanging for hours. A public statement. This became the new protocol. A damaged tool was classified as sabotage. Working too slowly was sabotage. Exchanging a piece of bread between barracks was a capital crime. In one instance, 3 men were accused of passing notes to the women's camp. The verdict was death by hanging. After the execution, guards searched the bodies. The number of notes they found was 0. By August 1943, the SS hunt for resistance became a preemptive slaughter. The new stage was the courtyard between Block 10 and Block 11, the Black Wall. Its surface was engineered for efficiency, lined with pressed cork to absorb bullets, painted black to hide the bloodstains. Through the night, the camp heard it, a dull, rhythmic sound of gunshots, growing into a continuous roar. Over 100 prisoners, Poles, Germans, Soviet POWs, dragged from their bunks, accused of organizing a food protest. They were shot immediately. No trial. Could such executions break the will to resist? By the end of 1943, the SS killed not for proven actions. They killed for the mere possibility of defiance. In September, the focus shifted to the women of Birkenau. At dawn, they were marched to newly built gallows, barefoot on the cold ground. Signs hung from their necks detailing their crimes. Discusses for the thousands of prisoners forced to watch. These were not symbols of shame. They were proof. The system was terrified. The bodies were left hanging for hours above the parade ground. The display of power had the opposite effect. It showed weakness. The administration's fear of a camp-wide rebellion did not subside. It intensified. The hunt for subversion became microscopic. The camp's political department began investigating even the smallest signs of solidarity. By late 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing. The Red Army was closing on Poland. An outside observer might expect the camp's system to weaken. It did the opposite. It industrialized terror. Permanent gallows became a fixed feature of the Auschwitz landscape. This was an institutional shift. Executions were no longer isolated acts of intimidation. They were integrated into the daily schedule, a process. In November 1944, this process was demonstrated. 6 Czech prisoners were accused of passing messages to the resistance. A single intercepted letter was enough. The men were executed by public hanging near the Birkenau gate. Inmates were marched past the bodies. The objective was total deterrence. 1 month later, December, 10 Polish prisoners were pulled from roll call. The accusation? Digging an escape tunnel behind Block 11. The charge required no proof. They were hanged in front of their barracks. The bodies remained on display for 24 hours. The SS believed public executions created order, but their fear of internal rebellion was justified. Inside the walls of the Union Werk munitions plant, a secret operation was already in motion. How do you destroy a crematorium under constant SS surveillance? You collect gunpowder. By the milligram, hidden under fingernails, inside hollowed-out buttons. The mechanics were precise. A pinch of black powder, scraped from a shell casing, packed into a tiny scrap of cloth, tucked into a seam or beneath a fingernail. The black dust vanished into the grime of a striped uniform. The operation had been running for 8 months. A standard hand grenade contains 50 grams of explosive. To gather that amount, the women risked summary execution hundreds of times. For milligrams, Alla Gertner, Regina Safferstein, Esther Weichblum. They worked the factory floor. They moved the powder. The coordinator was Rosa Robota. She did not work in the plant. Her position was in the clothing detail, a central hub. She took the tiny packages from the factory workers and passed them on. The material moved through a network of hidden pockets and silent transfers. It finally reached the hands of the Sonderkommando in Birkenau. The collected gunpowder was not a symbol, it was a component. On October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando ignited it. A dull explosion cut through the routine of Birkenau. The sound carried across the barracks, interrupting the machinery of the camp. At Crematorium 4, a wall buckled outward. The destruction came from the inside. The prisoners attacked the guards, with stones, with hammers, with any tool they could grab. It was a system malfunction turned into a counterattack. 3 SS officers were killed. The SS response was total. The zone was immediately sealed, every escape route cut. The uprising was crushed, but the accounting had just begun. 450 men were arrested. This was nearly half of the entire Sonderkommando unit. Some were executed on the spot. Others were dragged to the torture cells of Block 11. The remaining suspects were taken for interrogation. The SS investigation focused on the source, on the Union Werk's munitions plant, on the women who supplied the charge. Rosa Robota was arrested first. They took her to the cellars of Block 11. The interrogation was systematic, the torture precise. She said nothing. Soon, Alla Gardner, Regina Safferstein, and Esther Weichblum were taken. They were isolated in Block 10, interrogated, beaten. They were silent. Why torture them for weeks? The war's outcome was decided. The SS were desperate. They needed to break the entire resistance network before the front collapsed. On January 6, 1945, Soviet troops were less than 100 kilometers away. Rosa, Alla, Regina, and Esther were sentenced to death. They were marched to the women's camp in Birkenau. Wooden gallows had been prepared. Hundreds of female prisoners were forced out onto the roll call square to watch. They stood barefoot in the snow. SS guards beat anyone who collapsed from exhaustion or cold. The execution was slow, one by one. The absolute silence was broken only by the creak of a frozen rope. Liberation was 21 days away. Their bodies were left hanging. 12 days passed. The Eastern Front was collapsing. In January 1945, the SS began to erase the camp itself. First, the infrastructure of murder. Demolition teams dynamited the gas chambers. The crematoria were dismantled. Over Birkenau, the sky filled with thick smoke from burning archives. 5 years of records, turning to ash. Then, the liquidation of the prisoners. January 18th, 7 days before the Red Army arrived, the SS ordered the evacuation. The death marches began. The protocol was simple. Prisoners marched west in freezing weather. No food, minimal clothing. Those who collapsed were shot. Those who hid were found and executed. Suspicion was enough for a death sentence. Near the fence, they used the last remaining ropes for summary hangings. On that day alone, at least 30 prisoners were killed. January 27, 1945. Soviet soldiers breached the gates of Auschwitz. The SS were gone. Tens of thousands of prisoners already marched west. Inside, they found 7,000 survivors, or what was left of them. Many lay among the corpses, not yet dead, but too weak to stand up and greet their liberators. The gas chambers were dynamited, the archives burned to ash. So how do you prove the guilt of executioners who destroyed the murder weapon? Through the phenomenal memory of 7,000 survivors. They were the last indestructible archive. Every face, every name, every action. Their testimony would become the foundation for the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. It triggered a global manhunt for the architects and guards of the death machine.